Hello everyone, I'm Graham Phillips and welcome to the Cybercrime Revolution session. Should be really interesting, but let's first do an acknowledgement of country. We want to recognise and pay respect to the first scientists and acknowledge the important contribution this unique wisdom provides to contemporary scientific conversations and collaborations. We acknowledge the deep and timeless relationship between country and Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and pay respect to the elders of the communities and extend recognition to their descendants, both past and present. So let's now start off with just a little potted history of cybercrime over the decades. I think you'll be surprised how early it starts. In a telephone exchange in 1878, teenage boys were employed to run around the switchboard connecting telephone calls. Instead, they ended up running amok. They deliberately disconnected people and connected the wrong people. The program was swiftly fixed by employing women instead. In 1903, the Royal Institution in London was hosting a demonstration of a new secure wireless system for sending messages over long distances. The inventor, Marconi, was in Cornwall, 400 kilometres away, about to send messages when the Morse code printer instead received and printed the word rats over and over again, followed by a little rhyme. There was a young man from Italy who diddled the public quite prettily. The culprit of the hack was a long-time rival of Marconi's. In World War II, ciphers and code breaking come to the fore, as Alan Turing and others at Bletchley Park developed machines to decipher messages sent by the Germans. In 1971, using a toy whistle from a cereal box, Captain Crunch, as he became known, aka John Draper, was able to hack the telephone system for free long-distance calls. By the 1980s and 90s, people were being convicted for cybercrime. Their motivations were mostly for notoriety and knowledge. In 1988, a graduate student from Cornell University created the first computer worm. He did it to gauge the size of the internet. But the Morris worm ran out of control, resulting in Robert Morris's conviction. In 2010, the Stuxnet worm was uncovered. It's possibly the first digital weapon, although no one officially claimed responsibility for it. It reportedly took down 20% of the enrichment centrifuges in Iran's nuclear program. In 2021, there were cyber attacks on Eastern Health in Melbourne, Health Service Executive in Ireland, and Colonial Pipeline in Texas. And that last one resulted in a 75 Bitcoin ransom being paid. That's 4.4 million US dollars. Some of that money was later recovered. So as you can see, cybercrime's been around with us for quite a while, I suspect, probably as long as technology's been around with us. And it makes you wonder, what's going to happen with the rollout of 6G, which they're working on at the moment. We're going to have the Internet of Things, so physical objects will be connected to the Internet. We're going to have virtual reality. Who knows what the cybercrimes will be then? Maybe we'll find that in this panel discussion. So let's move on. Let's introduce the panellists right now. First up, we have Connie McIntosh, who has 20 years of experience in cybersecurity and is currently the head of security assurance for Ericsson Network Security. We have Bethany Fuller, who is with the Australian Federal Police, who is an investigator in cybercrime operations. She regularly collaborates with the FBI and other international bureaus. And we have Ernest Fu, who is an academic from Griffith University. His research centres on applied cybersecurity, particularly ways to detect cyber attacks on critical infrastructure systems. Pretty important thing, I suspect. Welcome, everyone. So look, I think before we even start
Thank you.
I think it'd be good to get a little bit of terminology straight. I've heard about this thing called red team, blue team. Maybe Bethany, you could just fill us in on what's that terminology about?
Yeah, absolutely. I can have a go at that. I don't think the terminology has changed too much. It's more about anyone can be a victim of cybercrime, essentially. And we work collaboratively with industry, and we do have, you could say, a red and a blue side where you've got the police working alongside security researchers working alongside financial institutions, working together to combat cybercrime, essentially.
So the blue team are the good guys. Does that mean the red team are the bad guys?
Absolutely, yes.
And you're all with the blue team, right?
Yes, yes.
Good.
And you can see with that increasing reliance on technology that we have, that we are becoming more vulnerable and susceptible to different types of cybercrime.
Okay, well, let's start off the conversation with sort of personal cybercrime, if you like. And, I know I continually now get texts about, what were you doing in this video? Click on this link to find out. Or, your package hasn't turned up. Well, you'll find out why by clicking on this link. I don't click on any of them, as tempting as it is sometimes when I am missing a package. But maybe, Ernest, you could tell us about what kind of, personal attacks are there?
No, I think the most common one that people will see is phishing attacks. You definitely will get that email where you'll be tempted to click on the link or even give some of your personal information away, and usually it's all in the bad guys attempting to be able to get money off you in some way. So, and I think one of the really interesting things that we're starting to realize is that there's this whole ecosystem to cybercrime that's behind behind this phishing email. There's groups of people who will actually write the software. And then there's a whole group of people who actually generate the spam, generate the phishing emails. And then there's even a whole group of people that'll do the money laundering and what happens afterwards when they've actually compromised machines. So yeah, it's a pretty large, sophisticated ecosystem.
Right, and so I guess, Bethany, you've sort of had a bit of experience with that ecosystem, I'm presuming, with the Australian Federal Police. Is it like, it's not just some teenage hacker like you see in the movies sitting in the basement programming away, trying to cause mayhem. It's quite a sophisticated group of people?
Yes, cybercrime is definitely a very complex and challenging crime type for us. It requires dedicated skill sets, substantial cooperation with our foreign law enforcement partners, those kinds of things. You can see the types of individuals that are committing cybercrimes can range from organised criminal syndicates to still that general person in the basement sort of thing that's fallen in with perhaps the wrong crowd online and is going out and testing their abilities.
And Connie, is this an issue for companies as well? I know I get these texts, but presumably these could be work related, right? It could cause problems at work if I start clicking on random links.
Absolutely. You're spot on there. As Ernest said, phishing is still, one of the most attractive ways of infiltrating a system or as an individual infiltrating your personal information. It's still the largest problem globally that we're faced with. And the reason really around that is adversaries are really cognizant of the fact that humans are the weakest link in any cybersecurity system. The way I look at it is, people generally will take the path of least resistance. And so if the human is the easiest way in, they'll absolutely take that. And, social engineering has a lot to do with it. People are nowadays putting more and more information online, making it easier and easier, to be socially engineered. And, and it just makes it so much easier. You talked about smishing where you're getting those via your SMSs, but there's also, vishing as well, the phone calls. I think you'd be well and truly all have had one of these where, Microsoft's calling you at home without you logging any problems, and suddenly they tell you you've got a problem on your computer. How often does that happen? Microsoft just doesn't call people, and so I'm really focused on the human factor. It's something that really fascinates me. I think there's been so many different studies, and one that I always quote is an IBM study where they said 95% of all successful cyber attacks are caused by human error. And, attackers, we make it really easy for them. They don't even have to do the work. They just send you a link and we, infect ourselves. So just by clicking on that, and we're making it far too easy, and of course you have your mobile applications, which, can bring, malware into your own phone or your computer if, you're not using an app store, if one of the easiest way, downloading directly from the internet and having no idea who's behind that, software and what you're doing with that. So, well, we're seeing a lot of that.
It's a good thing. I'm very careful about that. I choose my password to be my birth date, of course, which no one would know. So I think that's probably pretty safe. So, Ernest, can you tell me what would have happened? What would happen if I did click on one of those links? What would typically happen if I wanted that video of me doing something strange and I thought, gee, I really want to see that? What would happen? I've never been brave enough to try it.
So as soon as you click on the link, it'll try to, normally your computer will try to go to a particular website, and quite often that website will be malicious. And really what the bad guys want to do is gain access to your computer, and then from your computer into any accounts that you might have. So yeah, as soon as you click that link, the bad guys are looking for that access. So they might get access to your operating system, but it might be as simple as just even access to your browser and all the information that your browser might have collected along the way. So so they want to use that access to your system to either jump to another computer within your organization to go deeper in and to find more juicy secrets, so to speak, or they start looking for credit card credentials, or even just usernames and passwords, because people tend to reuse the same username and password from one account to another one. So if they happen to compromise your, library account, so to speak, if you're using the same password for your council library as you are using for your bank account, that's what the bad guys are starting to do.
Bethany, do you have individuals coming to the police with this kind of cybercrime happening? Is it an increasing thing, and what sort of information do you tell them? How do you do anything about that?
Yeah, so where the AFP comes into in reporting of cybercrimes essentially is we're really focused on that unauthorised access on critical infrastructure. I think in terms of reporting of cybercrime, there is a significant underrepresentation of the cyber-enabled sort of offences when you're talking about cyberbullying, the phishing, those kinds of things, versus the cyber-dependent sort of crimes when you're talking about DDoS attacks and that strictly unauthorised access. When individuals are making reports, there is a collective page they navigate to now, and that is Report Cyber, and that's where we tell victims to input their information into that, and then it will be allocated out to the relevant state and territory where that victim is located. I think it's really important in the space cyber is at this time is we're really getting on the front foot of that prevention messaging and education to the wider public. So hopefully we can prevent the offence occurring in the first instance and not have to go down that investigation pathway.
Do you have any feel for how many people do fall for those kind of texts and things? Because it's all very well I'm saying I would never do it, but you never know, you're in the sort of heat of the moment, you are expecting a package, it seems legitimate, and bang, you've pushed it before you know. Do we have a feel for how many people are getting caught with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't got the statistics off the top of my head, but it is definitely a significant high volume type of crime. Those scam text messages you're getting, I get them myself. You talk to your friend next door, they'll get the text messages yourself. So it's about reporting that as well, because if you're not making a report of that message being received, we're not really capturing those statistics then, are we? So, but I would say, yeah, there is a definite uptake in the volume of cybercrime.
And Connie, what do you do to stop, people using the same password over and over in an organisation, or using their birth date or something, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, I don't know. Is facial recognition a better thing than passwords? Would it be better if we all had to check in with our faces? But I guess our faces could be stolen, right?
Yeah, no, your face is not going to get stolen. Well, not yet. Wait for quantum computing. That's a different thing. But let's just say most organisations nowadays have standards for their passwords. So maybe I would say the most common minimum should be 12. 12 characters, uppercase, and plus a special character. But really, it's about implementing two-factor or multi-factor authentication so that you're not relying on passwords. I mean, passwords are, it takes seconds to breach a password if you're using a dictionary word. So, I would definitely recommend if, there's anybody out there not using multi-factor authentication in an organization that you adapt and adopt it really fast because, if you've ever seen or hacked yourself and seen how quickly it is to break a password, it's terribly easy. And we're not doing ourselves any favors if we aren't mitigating against that.
Yeah, and the problem is, I guess you've got to write it down because it's so complicated then, and then you're worried about that, leaking out.
Hopefully not.
All right,
hopefully not. There's password managers, but also having a password manager is keys to your kingdom also, so that is why, more than one factor is important.
Okay, well, let's move on to big business being attacked because I guess there's more money to be made, right, out of you're attacking a big organisation rather than an individual. And maybe if we go back to you, Ernest, I mean, we've heard a lot about a denial of service attack. Can you tell us about these?
Oh, yeah. So I guess denial of service attacks are where the bad guys will send a lot of requests, a lot of traffic towards a single server or a single service, and basically they just get overwhelmed by all of the requests and a lot of these requests would be kind of fake or they don't expect a response, so then that it pretty much shoves out all the legitimate responses that come in. I suppose that's the traditional denial of service attack, but then you could also class ransomware, which is where an attacker has been able to gain access and then they encrypt important information or other kinds of things. And because they've encrypted that information and then they're basically using extortion to say pay up so you can get back to your data. That's also a denial of service because they're actually preventing you from accessing the system that you want to get to. And yeah, these kinds of denial of service attacks we are seeing far more of nowadays because the organised cyber criminals out there, they're seeing a lot more profit come in through these ransomware type attacks than they would have in the past, and so that's why it's so much more popular, I think, to do that.
And are you finding
and
sorry, you keep speaking.
Yeah, I was going to say, and it's not limited to small businesses anymore. Just like you were saying before, is that they're looking for bigger organisations because they can see there's a bigger payoff to be made. So that it's the big game hunters, so to speak. They're trying to get the big guys to be able to give over money.
And Bethany, is this a trend that the AFP have noticed, that it's more bigger organisations are being attacked now?
I wouldn't say a trend that we've become aware of. I think cybercrime is borderless in its nature and anyone can be a victim of cybercrime. I don't think that's changed per se. That's what I have on that one.
Yeah, and the denial of service attack, Ernest, that maybe that's old days, is it? Where they would just sort of bombard your system so you couldn't do anything. I mean, what would be the purpose of that? No one's making any money out of that.
Oh, yeah. So I mean, you have to look at the motivations of attackers. So I mean, we talked about cyber criminals who are looking to gain money, but then there's also activists out there, or hacktivists, so to speak, and they might have another kind of agenda. They want to actually make some news for themselves or something like that, and so they might actually do one of those traditional denial of service attacks, bring down a web page or something like that. And we've seen that happen all around the world when people want to actually make a statement, so to speak. So in Hong Kong, when there was that trouble with Hong Kong and China, there was a lot of cyber ransomware attacks on government websites at that stage. And certainly in Russia and the Ukraine, there's a lot of that toing and froing happening. That's people trying to make a statement. And depending on how big that is, that would be, whether we hear it in the news or not.
And Connie, there's only so much you can disclose about this, but in your organisation, have you got ways to protect against, either the ransomware or these more traditional denial of service attacks? It almost seems those first ones are hard to avoid, isn't it? If suddenly there's a whole lot of traffic on your website, what can you do?
Yeah, all organisations would be monitoring and protecting against those types of attacks. If it's a sustained attack, obviously you can, contact your network telco provider and have those shut down or redirected or blocked. There's many things you can do, but it is interesting to note. I just want to go back to your DDoS example because, whilst we think that might be something that's of the past, let's use Black Friday sales as an example. If you want to cripple your competitor or redirect, people to your website, you get your competitor's website taken down, and then you're going to block their business. So it's still a viable, an active threat to the business. Yeah,
interesting. What's the legality on doing a denial of service attack on a competitor that's dressed up to be something a little bit legitimate, like I don't know. What, Bethany, is that something you could comment on?
It doesn't matter if it's dressed up to be legitimate sort of thing. Did they have permission? No. So it's an offence in the simplest terms.
But what if they're sort of just hitting that website with a lot of requests, that could seem to be legitimate requests because there's a sale on, but they're not really, you know what I mean? Is there a grey area there, or is that hard to police that line or not?
I think, I can see where you're coming from in saying that it could be hard to police, and cybercrime is a complex crime type in that when we're talking about offences being committed and we're looking at the elements of those offences to get it before the court, they can be difficult when you're talking about proving that intention element to it. And that really comes down to our methodology and how we approach the investigation. But covering off on, first of all, did the victim give you permission? No. In the simplest way I can explain it, yes.
Yeah, it often comes down to those simplicities in crime, really, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, and I'd add to that attribution is incredibly difficult. Most people don't use their own IP address to do these types of things. They're going through Tor networks, or they're going to the dark net or the dark web, whatever, terminology, depending on what marketplace they're using to buy this service. So you can't even attribute it to them if you even found the IP addresses that these were originating. So it is incredibly difficult.
Can you tell us?
I'd like to add as well.
Yeah.
In that, just to emphasise what Connie's saying about attribution and trying to find out who actually did anything. And so it's become a really attractive point to cybercrime, is that it's really hard to be able to track down the source of these things, because you can do multiple hops all over the world before you actually get to your destination. And so, and even the people who do commit the crimes may be in a country that's remote to Australia, that we don't have extradition treaties with, and so people can freely conduct these kinds of attacks. And then and also governments can also look towards cyberspace as an avenue for making those statements or doing those kinds of attacks, and to do it with a certain level of freedom, knowing that that they can never really prove that it was them. An example might have been the supposed North Korea attack against Sony for producing a movie about, or the interview movie, and there was no actual proof that it was actually North Korea. But everyone would sit back and go, who else? But it makes it really hard.
Yeah, I was going to say that sort of guessing intention is a difficult thing when you're coming to enforcing law. I guess you try to look for the hard evidence rather than saying, well, look, they were standing there, they've got something to gain. So I imagine that can make it quite difficult. Connie, you mentioned the dark web just before. Can you run us through what that is exactly?
It is a place where you can go anonymously. It has its own marketplace. It has information sharing. It's a place where, criminals generally are operating. It's not, usually for, the normal user. And so in the marketplace, you can buy almost anything illegal. Let's say it's where, if you are a hacker and you're scraping credit cards, you will, or passport information, you will take them to the darknet and the darknet marketplace, and you'll sell them. You'll find buyers for them. They trade in all types of, physical, assets as well as, information assets.
Ernest, is it? I mean, it's in simple terms, is the darknet just a bunch of servers that are sort of off the main internet that are interconnected in some way? Is that most of us don't have access to? Is that right? What is it physically?
Yeah. So the history of the dark web is really interesting because it was actually developed by the US Navy as a way of communication for their spies or the people in hostile areas to be able to communicate back to them without being traced or tracked. And it's actually layers upon layer of encryption, which actually provides that anonymity to the endpoints within the dark web. So you can go through the dark web, or you could be based in the dark web, and it uses the same kind of protocols that we would for the internet, but it has a different type of addressing scheme. So you could almost think of it as a separate kind of internet, but it still uses a lot of the same type of technologies. And yeah, the key thing about it is that it provides anonymity to everyone in there, and so that's why it's attractive for criminals as well, is because they can post things on websites within the dark web with confidence that it's very difficult to track them down. So that's why Connie's saying you can find marketplaces for drugs and arms and munitions and a whole lot of other things on there as well. And so it is, but it is also kind of a dangerous place because dangerous people kind of hang out there. So.
And I certainly don't want to.
Yeah, and you can't just Google an address.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Yeah,
it's
dark
not
web, please.
Crawled. Yeah. Nobody can just go find something.
Yeah, you have to know about it ahead of time. So it's kind of like, and again, that's why the criminals like it, because you have to be in on that kind of thing, and though there are kind of indexes for the dark web, you kind of have to know where they are, and of course. People like Bethany and the AFP will go and try to shut down those things, but then every time something gets shut down, another one pops up. So yeah. And
that's the way you would get into that, is you get given one of those indexes by a fellow criminal or something like that. Yeah. Not that I'm trying to fish that out, but. So maybe we can talk. We were talking about ransomware a little while ago. Could you just run us through, Ernest, is it the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident?
Oh, yes. So I think late last year it was that there was the Colonial Pipeline is actually an oil pipeline that takes petrol and jet fuel and other kinds of oil from the Gulf at the southern end of the US and pipes it all the way up the east coast of America to where the more larger populations like Washington, New York, and all those kind of places are. So it actually is almost like a lifeline for the fuel on the east coast of America. And what happened was that system, it's all controlled by computers, and at some point they were infected with ransomware, and so the ransomware got in and did what it did, encrypted key files and said, if you want them unencrypted, please pay up some money, and as a response, the company actually shut down their operations. So just to stop the ransomware from being able to get into the control systems that actually control the pipelines. So in shutting that pipeline down, it stopped the supply of fuel the northeast part of the US, and so fuel prices rocketed up, and people couldn't get petrol into their cars and other kinds of things, and so pretty much stalled that part of the US, which is a main part of the US as well, and one of the interesting things about the pipeline ransomware attack was that it was decided to actually pay the ransom. And I think if we talk to Bethany, the rules are don't pay the ransom, because you're just encouraging people to do it. But in this case, it was very widely publicised that they paid the ransom, something like 75 bitcoins. That matches up to about $4 or $5 million US or something like that. And so they paid the ransom, and because they did that, the data was released, and they were able to operate again after about a week of downtime. And I think that sounds like the bad guys had a win, but the other side of the story is that the good guys also had a win, because they had to pay it in bitcoins, and the FBI was right on it and managed to recover 60 out of the 75 bitcoins. So that was a win for the good guys as well. But it is interesting from an academic point of view, because, and this comes back to my earlier comments about it being a huge ecosystem, because the hackers, who are called DarkSide, the FBI was able to recover all the money that was to go to DarkSide, but 15% of it had already been distributed by DarkSide to the people that they had to pay to use the software, to do the monetization, to the people in the ecosystem. They'd already paid them, and that's why the money was lost straight away from them.
Gee, it's sounding like a very sophisticated operation. Apart from the illegal act, it seems like a business kind of thing.
Oh, it definitely is. It's like we're talking millions of dollars here. Like it's not just a few $100s from someone down the street. This is millions of dollars to keep a country running.
Connie, have you had any experience with having ransomware problems?
When I worked for the government, we certainly assisted companies that, and they were from critical infrastructure to, even at that stage, even small business would call us because they didn't know what to do. And, we had certainly helped a number of companies in that situation. But as Ernest mentioned, the government's position in Australia is do not pay. And unlike Colonial Pipeline, you are very unlikely to ever get that money back, and you are very unlikely to get the keys to unlock that data. It's not always a given. So, we really want to deter people from paying to make us obviously a less attractive target as a country.
So, Bethany, what happens if, a company has one of these ransomware attacks, everything's frozen up? What should they do? What's the next step?
Well, absolutely. I'd be looking to, first of all, make a contact with the police and fill in that report on Report Cyber to engage with that sort of assistance you're going to get from the police. Additionally, I'd be restoring from my backups. Those backups I take regularly, that would allow me to get my infrastructure back up and running, especially if there's other members of the public and general other organisations that are relying on my business functioning. So you'd want to get back up and online as soon as possible. Other things, we really want to get in the space of preventing ransomware, essentially, and that comes back to your core business may not be cybercrime at all when you're talking about like the JBS food attack, and you're looking at JBS being a meat supplier to the majority of Australia, very well known. You may have heard of Primo. You see it in the supermarkets. When you're talking about a big business like that, and when they are impacted, we really need to look at having that cybersecurity element being incorporated into how their business runs, and having that forward-leaning posture so they don't become a victim of cybercrime.
Can you tell us a bit about that cybercrime that was committed?
Yeah, so that essentially it's much similar to the Colonial Pipeline attack, and they were a victim of ransomware, and that the ransomware attack happened in America, in their site over there, and they were required again to pay a ransom for their infrastructure to be restored and for them to be up and running again. And again, they did pay the ransomware, unfortunately, this instance as well. Again, that's something we recommend you do not do. And that takes me to another point as well. When you're talking about companies thinking you can pay the ransomware because you've got ransomware insurance, and generally these insurance companies that provide ransomware insurance publish who their clients are. So that by itself is identifying yourself as a potential victim of ransomware in the future.
Yeah, I imagine that's a real issue. Ernest, why demand payment in Bitcoin? I guess it's untraceable, right?
Yeah, well, it's thought to be, but in actual fact, it is very traceable actually, and that's why the FBI were able to actually track down the accounts. The main reason why is that there's a belief that there's true anonymity in Bitcoin, but in actual fact, Bitcoin uses blockchain technology, and in each one of the blocks, it records down all the transactions that happen. So you might not know who owns the account, but you can definitely find the account number inside there, and so that way you can actually try to track the funds as it goes. And certainly as there's more transactions that takes place, it certainly waters down more and more as that happens. But the initial payments, you'll know who that bad guy was, and it's a matter of just speed of action at that point in terms of can the good guys catch the second transaction that happens before the bad guy goes and instantly spends all of his money, all of his winnings, so to speak. So yes, but the other thing is, yeah, we know the account number, but we don't know who owns that account.
Were there any convictions from the Colonial Pipeline incident?
As far as I know, I don't know if there were any publicised convictions yet. But certainly, I think that federal policing agencies would be working strongly against trying to catch those people. But again, if those people are in Eastern Europe or in Russia or in China, it's very difficult to make a conviction.
Connie, is there a reluctance for businesses to talk about cyber attacks?
Yeah, no, not so much anymore, because I think it's not if it happens, it's when for a business. I think it's a reality of the world we live in. So I think more and more you're seeing businesses come together and really maybe, not publicly talk about it, but certainly share information, indicators of compromise. In Australia, the government holds these, sessions, information sharing sessions where, business gets together and talks about what they're seeing. And there's a lot of value in that because, you can be able to, mitigate against some of the risks that you're seeing other people experience if you are sharing information. And what I note, what has always historically been is that Australia tends to be a week and sometimes 2 weeks behind the rest of the world in attacks. So we can really leverage those information sharing relationships to make sure that, that we're protecting ourselves.
And Bethany, you'd agree with that? People should be talking about it, at least should be mentioning it to the police, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. So you've got the Australian Cybersecurity Centre in Canberra, headquartered, responsible, and that is where, when you are a victim of a cybercrime, and if you did call up the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, they would perhaps provide that initial support to you. With that, though, and becoming a partner for big businesses with the Australian Cybersecurity Centre and the joint cybersecurity centres in the different states and territories, they regularly publish what they're seeing in terms of the different types of attacks and vulnerabilities. And again, that goes back to what Connie said. It's really important about sharing that information so we can update our security settings and patch those vulnerabilities to prevent those attacks occurring.
Yeah, I guess that's what Team Blue, one of the big advantages of Team Blue is if you all work together as a team, you've got a chance against the baddies.
Yes.
And tell us about the ANOM app. Is it ANOM? It was sort of a You know, maybe the blue team was taking on a few of the red team's tactics there.
Yeah. So Anom is part of Operation Ironside. That's been heavily publicised in the media. That comes back to the AFP's long-standing relationship with the FBI, and that was a collaboration with the FBI. Essentially, it was a 3-year investigation run where we monitored an encrypted application that was on phones that were disseminated in an underground market with trusted distributors to high world criminal figures, essentially, that are involved in organised crime, in outlaw motorcycle gangs, distributing border controlled drugs, those kinds of offences. And so over those 3 years, we were able to monitor the communications that those organised crime figures believed were being encrypted and nobody else was viewing, and from that able to impact a worldwide disruption activity where we were able to take down these figures and put them before the court for their offending, essentially.
Yeah, no, very, very clever trick, I think. It must have been very carefully planned. Ernest, do you see this as a way of fighting cybercrime in the future, perhaps, that there might be more of this?
Certainly, I think one of the things that we tell the blue team is to think like the red team. So if we can think like the red team, and we can anticipate what they're going to do, but we can also, try to defend better against it. And I think this is an example of actually striking back a little bit. And one of the, I suppose one of the things that we teach whenever you do penetration testing is it's about gathering information, and I think the Anom app was all about gathering information and then being able to use that to get those convictions.
And you mentioned penetration testing there. Is that some way of testing how secure your system is?
Oh yes, so that's it's when usually a corporation might hire some consultants who would have skills in hacking into systems and get them to test it against their systems and to see how far could the bad guys possibly go. So it's about testing your systems against the bad guys without actually having them being real bad guys. So yeah.
I was going to say, Connie, are they real bad guys? I mean, I know back in the old days they talked about white hat hackers and black hat hackers, and people sometimes swap teams, you know. Does that still go on now, or not so much now?
Yeah, it's not so common to suddenly become a white hat, being an ethical hacker who would be on a blue team from a red team. It has happened. Kevin Mitnick, one of the world's most famous hackers, once on the FBI's most wanted list, he turned from, a bad hacker to a good hacker, and now he's helping businesses worldwide. And I think, going back to Ernest's point, about, think like a hacker to defend against them. There's no more truer thing. You need to think like a hacker, know your enemy, know yourself. And certainly penetration testing your own systems, if you don't have those expertise in-house, then you should definitely have it done. Because basically that is an ethical or a white hat hacker who is blue teaming against your organization to find those holes that the red teamers will find. And that gives you the opportunity to patch or mitigate or, update software. There's a whole range of things that they'll find when hacking a system. But I think it's something critical that just needs to be in the toolbox of all businesses nowadays.
And is that something most businesses would do these days?
Absolutely. I would think every large business would do that. I mean, that's just standard practice. Yeah, working towards any type of, ISO 27001 or NIST or any of those frameworks, it's part of being compliant. So it's very much an important part of protecting yourself.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, let's move on to the next part of the discussion, which is about, we touched on it earlier, about state-sponsored attacks. I guess, once again, you're moving up from individuals that have only got so much money and you can only cause so much mayhem to organisations. But, if you can attack a whole country, we're moving into cyber warfare then, I guess. I mean, maybe, Ernest, you could kick that off. Why do people do this?
Yep. Well, I suppose it's the cut and thrust of international politics. I suppose when you think about nation states and cyber attacks are just one of the tools that they have in their arsenal nowadays to be able to send messages to other governments and things like that. And I think conducting a cyber attack against another country could send them a message to say, this is a warning shot, so to speak, without actually having to hurt anybody or to invade a territory, but you can send a message. But I think nation states are also have different motivations than cyber criminals. So cyber criminals are all about the money. They want to be able to make a profit at some stage, but nation states are more about gaining information and gaining influence over another country. And so that's where the differences are. The typical cyber criminal, they'll want to stay hidden until the ransomware happens, and then all of a sudden they're all over the shop. You can tell they're there, right? Whereas the nation states, they want to stay hidden until such a time as to where they absolutely must take action or have to take action. So, and in the meantime, though, they stay hidden and they collect information, they collect data, which they can use perhaps against another nation state. So any state secrets or other kinds of things, as well as maybe, and we've heard it in the news lately, influencing elections or other kind of political systems from happening, and just making it favour more towards their country than another country or something like that. So I think the initial thing for nation states is that they want to find sensitive information and to use it and to hold it until such time when they can use it, or they would exert influence over another country using that information, or through control of systems. And then finally, if it ever does come to it, and I think we'll see it in the Ukraine and Russia, when it does come to a physical conflict, then the cyber attacks and all those things will happen prior to the actual physical conflict. So what would have happened possibly is Russia has been hacking Ukraine infrastructure, gaining access, sitting there with their hand over the button to say, okay, tell me when, hit the button, all the power goes out, troops come over the border, that kind of stuff. So cyber attacks will be used in that case nowadays. And I guess interesting in a train wreck kind of way to see what happens in that sense, because if it does come to a major conflict, this will probably be one of the first ones where cyber attacks will be part of that.
Yeah. I mean, the critical infrastructure would be the telephone system, Connie, as well. I mean, are there special protections in place for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all critical infrastructure, is targeted, but there's definitely protections in place. But it's not even always about the logical attack. It's also physical attacks. If you want to take out, a nation's telco, we then attack the infrastructure directly. You can do that, obviously, within the software itself. But we're seeing, there's physical damage that is a lot easier for nations that maybe aren't so advanced in their cybercrime, and that certainly creates a disruption and sends a message, and that's usually what the country is after. And what I find also that we haven't touched on yet is when we talk about nation states, there's often a lot of game playing going. I've read articles where a country will certainly put use a language in there to deflect from themselves and make it look like it's another country doing this attack. So, it's a dangerous line, when we talk around attribution on attacks, because it's sometimes purposely made to look like it's coming from a certain country when it may not be. And, so that's something that, makes it very hard to with nation states to provide attribution, because they're very, very sophisticated. They do this for a living. They have hackers working 24/7. They are incredibly sophisticated at what they do, and often building their own tools, so that it makes it very hard to defend against.
Yeah, because I guess if they're state sanctioned, then that's like a real job. They're not really doing anything illegal in their country, right? They're just got a regular job.
Yes.
Bethany, have you had to deal much with sort of state-sponsored cybercrime?
I'd go back to one point in that everyone can be a victim of cybercrime due to its borderless nature. With the funding the government provided the Australian Federal Police, that 89.9 million, as a result of the Australian Cybersecurity Strategy 2020, we have been very forward-leaning in uplifting our capability and increasing the partnerships we have with foreign law enforcement agencies, including posting additional members into different countries in the US, in Pretoria, Belgrade, really so we can increase the information and cooperation that is being shared, and make sure that regardless of where you reside, you're not really out of reach, to be honest. So.
Ernest, you mentioned the influencing elections. Can you run us a bit through how that process works?
I suppose it depends on the type of elections and how digitised they are. Certainly, there are some elections, maybe not for Parliament or things like that are digitised, and because of that, there's opportunities to break into systems to do that. But then there's also and I know we kind of like fill in the forms, and the forms get submitted, but those voting ballots, at some stage they get digitized, right? So it's at that point that it's possible for people to come in and influence those things. Having said that, there's also about spreading information and disinformation at that point, and we've heard about fake news, and so that can fit into the area as well in terms of affecting elections, in terms of getting false information out there, especially if you target specific electorates or something like that, to get people to believe one thing over another thing. So there's many different ways to affect elections, and I think one of the famous elections, so to speak, or surveys was where in the UK they were wanting to name a boat. A research boat that was going to go out into the Arctic and do research, and so they said, let's put it up on the internet and get people to vote for the most popular name, right? And then so that's why they ended up with Boaty McBoatface as the name of the boat, because someone really liked it and they just made that name there. So it's very interesting when you do different types of elections and put them out there. You never know who's going to vote and how they're going to get influenced those elections.
Yeah, I mean, it really is, we talk about the virtual world, the development of this virtual world, but it's becoming a very real thing, isn't it? It's becoming like another frontier where there's a whole marketplaces on there in the dark web, there's cyber attacks, like it's a new world. Which brings me to think a bit about the future, where we talk about the Internet of Things, and maybe one of you could tell us about that. In fact, Connie, do you want to what is the Internet of Things? And that's coming, right, with 6G technology.
Absolutely. I mean, with 6G technology, they're saying that it's likely there will be billions of IoT devices connected. Usually IoT is quite a dumb device, as in it is a low battery. It doesn't need a lot to run it. It simply is gathering data and then pushing it into a data lake or, somewhere that it can be found. Things like, weather monitoring stations, there's a whole range of, small IoT devices, and they're getting smaller and smarter. You could consider, your new toasters that you can turn them on with your phone is an IoT device. Light bulbs are IoT devices. There are so many now, and then there's so many new use cases coming for IoT devices in the future. And I think what we see with those is that they're not terribly well designed, as in they usually have a baked-in password that can't be changed. And so hacking that is very simple. If you know what a standard baked-in password, then you can target a company you're looking at getting their information. And of course, most companies would isolate their IoT network. They would not have it mixed in, but that's not always the case. And then maybe the IoT device information itself is what is, attractive target, depending on, the use case for that. So I think it's something that will change the way we do a lot of things. Everything, will be done on a network of some sort in the future. We can particularly talk about, AI ML when we're talking about these new automated cars, cars that will be intelligent enough to know the route. You won't even have to put it in. You just tell them where you're wanting to go. They'll find the best route. They'll look for, other cars. They'll talk to each other. They'll look for pedestrians, those types of things. And then you're talking about full factories that are run purely on, IoT devices that, need very little human intervention. So it's a real new world that we're going to be coming to in the next, how many years, 20, 30, we will see an industrial revolution again.
And so we're talking about red team artificial intelligences versus blue team artificial intelligences, right? We could have the robots fighting with each other. Wow.
Absolutely. And that is, I think, absolutely where it will go. You're going to have, of course, quantum computing coming, which will then speed up, the processing power of the computer, and you will have it going over 6G, which is said to be potentially 1 terabit a second. Now, if you talk about those two things, that is speed and latency, at its ultimate. And I can only imagine, the computing power we will, see in the future, and then how we defend is going to be a whole different ball game to what we're doing now. Now, current encryption will not stand up, to advanced quantum computing, and that's something we really need to be thinking about now. And many R&D places are thinking about that now. It's not that it's not being thought about. It's just that, if we go by the standard law of how fast computers go, every 2 years they double. We are in an arms race, I think, against the attacks that will come.
Is this something that excites you, Bethany, or you think, oh no, what's my life going to be like in a few years' time?
No, I like to think that ideally you want to be more, obviously with policing, we're quite reactive. We're waiting for that offence and then we're reacting to what's already occurred. But we want to be more preventative and be on the front foot with our thinking and being innovative in how we're tackling these emerging crime types that are coming out of cybercrime, essentially. So, and that comes down to how we're recruiting with our technical specialists that we bring to the AFP to work alongside the investigators and looking for people that really think differently, think to the future sort of thing. And yeah, that's where we're going towards, I hope.
And Ernest, with this 6G network, we could have virtual reality and augmented reality, right? And we've got the Metaverse, Are they going to pose unique cybercrime problems, do you think? Can we imagine even what they'll be?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I think cybercrime will be very much like physical crime, except just done at a larger scale, and done a lot more faster, and I guess a lot more efficiently from their side. But I think it'll be a long time before we can just leave it to the machines to do things. We're still going to need humans to operate the software, to understand exactly what's happening, and then to make the key decisions as to what actions need to be conducted next. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for young people who might be listening out there to think about a career in cybersecurity, because it will be one looking towards new technologies, new types of attacks, but then also to understand and to be able to apply artificial intelligence, machine learning, those kind of things to this space, and to learn about how to manage and protect data. That would be your own personal data, or the data for the organisation you work for, or for the country that you live in.
Bethany, I can see you nodding your head there. So is there big future jobs prospects for kids who are studying at school at the moment in the cybercrime area, in your view?
Oh, absolutely. Even at the moment, we're running a promotional round externally, looking to recruit people into the AFP, ranging from having that coming straight out of uni with a degree potentially in cybersecurity into the AFP versus someone who's got more security experience coming in at a higher level, to really assist us in being innovative in how we're tackling cybercrime. Yeah, it's definitely something we're trying to be on the front foot and a step ahead in how we're tackling it.
And Connie, I'm guessing your advice might be similar.
Yeah, absolutely. I advocate massively for diversity in your team, because they do say men are from Mars and women are from Venus, and nowhere is that more apparent when you're in a cyber team. I've been in a team doing threat hunting or active exercises where you really do see the different ways of thinking come through, and I think to be really on top of that, you do need to have the diversity of a team to make sure that you're leading in that thinking, and you don't just have one way of thinking about things. And I've been a huge advocate of getting girls and women into cybersecurity, because the fact is there are so many different jobs in cybersecurity, and I always get the message from girls particularly that I don't like coding, I'm not interested in coding, so I can't get into cyber. And I say, you know what, there are only a handful of jobs in cyber where you will be coding, and don't pick one of those. There are so many other types of roles that you can get into, but what you need is a passion about curiosity. If you've got someone that's passionate about what they're doing and they've got a curious mind, you can teach them anything. And so what I see is the next future generation should just be really a diverse group, and I am really focused on that when building my own team, in looking at make sure we have that diversity of thinking, not just male, female, but the whole, different backgrounds, different experiences. They don't always have to have been, a long time in cyber, but if they've got the passion and curiosity and an ability to learn, then, you can bring people in and train them. And that's my probably, largest message to any organization. Look within your own IT service desks. This is where you will find a lot of females. Somehow they attracted to that, and maybe it's the fact that they like talking to people, and women talk a lot generally, and so take from within and then build them up. I mean, that's how you're going to keep your corporate knowledge, but also build a diverse team going forward.
Look, what a wonderful message to finish on. Thank you very much. I'm feeling much more confident that the new generation has got things under control. We'll keep the red team under control. And I love the fact, Ernest, that you don't think the robots are going to take over soon. That's a big relief for me. Thank you very much. It's been fascinating. Thanks for your contribution. And thank you. Hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you.
It was a very interesting session from my point of view, and become a cybersecurity person.